Didn't go. Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. All right. I haven't done this for a while, so I'm out of practice. As Bill said, I always enjoy coming here. It's one of the few places I speak I really like to come. So, primarily because I don't have to get on a damn airplane. So, that makes it nice. This is based on a new book that I'm one of the, there's three of us. I'm one of the, I don't know what you say when you have three. You can't have tri-authors. It's co-authors, but there's more than two. So at any rate, there's three of us with the authors of it. It's based on 10 years of research that came out of the West Star Institute. And it's basically on the first 2 centuries. Technically up to 212, which is the so-called Antonine Constitution, where all free males became Roman citizens in the Roman Empire. That kind of changed everything. That's probably more technicality than you really want to know. Whenever people start asking me about history, I always have that same feeling when my children ask me about sex. Just how much do they want to know, you know? So at any rate, I'm going to do 2 weeks. This week is the bad news, that there are no Christians in the first 2 centuries. In fact, when we put the file here, Bill and I were, the file in which this program was in said, "No Christians, Harvard Avenue." So at any rate, and next week we're going to do the good news, 6 surprises from the first 2 centuries. 6 things that you probably don't think about that happened in the first 2 centuries, but really are quite remarkable, and I think fundamentally sensational. One of them will really excite disciples. That is that most people in the first 2 centuries were called not disciples, but students, which is the same word. Mathetes means a student, or in theological talk, disciple, which is nonsense. Okay. The first problem is you have to kind of figure out what's a Christian, or what is Christianity. They're basically interchangeable. And here's the dictionary definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. If you don't know, the OED is the dictionary. That's what every scholar goes to, is the OED. All life begins in the OED, you know. And this dictionary, when it was printed, was 28 volumes. And it's a historical dictionary. It's not meant, it's meant to give you the history of a word. This definition was written in the first edition in 1886. So it's original. It has not been changed. It has remained. This article was reviewed and refurbished 2 years ago, and they left it alone. Decided there had been no change in the language. This definition, which Murray, the original editor, wrote, is almost identical to the one in Johnson's dictionary, the famous first major dictionary of the English language. So the meaning of this of Christianity has been very stable for a very long time. Now, what makes up a Christian? First of all, it has to be a recognizable religion. The problem with the first 2 centuries is you can't recognize anybody. They all look different. Okay? They're doing different kinds of things. They don't identify themselves in some easy way. And there aren't enough of them. Archaeologically, you usually don't get evidence of a group until you get to about 200,000. You have to have a certain mass to leave products, and you have to start to look different from the culture you're in. When you first start off, you look like the culture you're in. So we don't get archaeological evidence of this group until late in the 2nd century. There's nothing prior to that. So that's when you get to about 200,000. If you can actually do the math if you want to, it's kind of silly. But if you take 12 and multiply it by 5% a year per annum, you'll reach 200,000 in about 195. And 5% is the normal growth rate of new religions. That's what the Mormons have been growing at 5%. So it's just a figure. It doesn't mean a whole lot, but it actually turns out to work pretty well. You have to have fixed beliefs and practices. There are no fixed beliefs in the first 2 centuries. When I taught in the seminary, I would get students every once in a while who would say, well, all Christians believe. And it really irritated me because I had a room full of Christians who all didn't believe the same thing at all. I mean, Phillips was a very diverse student body with a lot of different denominations, and despite what you think all Christians believe, they don't. So I would divide the class into groups, and they'd have to come up with 3 things that all Christians believed in. That is, if they could get their little group to agree with. And then when everybody would come back, we'd put them all together and say, okay, how big a list can we make? We'd get 3, 4 items that everybody could agree on. And then their next assignment was find out when Christians began to believe those things. And they would never be able to find anything in the first 2 centuries. And it was a great historical research. They learned how to do research on something that counted. There's no beliefs, there's no creeds, there's no set practices. Okay? It's just not there. They are figuring it out. And in a sense, they're making it up as they go along. That's what groups do. That's how you get started. Most importantly, to be Christian means not to be Jewish. Okay? It's built into the definition. These people thought they were Jewish. They all thought they were Jewish. Okay. But everybody says, especially in a Disciples of Christ group, what about Acts 11:26? And the disciples were called Christians in Antioch. That's where you get the name of your church. Well, there are problems. Problems and more problems. Problem number 1. The Greek word Christianos, this is the word that usually gets translated Christian, okay? But I'm going to have to don't drift off on this part, please. Just hold on. I know a foreign language is scare everybody, but I didn't put it in the Greek alphabet. I at least put it in the English alphabet. Christianos is seldom used in the first 2 centuries. That's the first problem. It's almost, I say here, probably not in the 1st century. I think almost certainly not used in the 1st century. Seldom in the first half of the 2nd century, and only rarely in the second half of the 2nd century. So you're getting pretty far down the pike before the word starts to come into common use. It is widely used to identify the group in the 3rd century. In the 3rd century, it all of a sudden becomes not the only term, but a major term that starts to get used. By far the most common term to refer to this group in the first 4 centuries is mathetes, students or disciples. That's by far the most common term. Okay. Problem number 2. What does Christianos mean? Now, here gets a little tricky. Hold on. You have to make a distinction between transliteration and translation. When people translate Christianos as Christian, they're not translating, they're transliterating. They just take the characters over into the new language. So Christianos in Greek becomes in Latin Christianus, and in English Christian. So you're not translating, you're just taking the letters over. Why do you take the letters over? Because you don't know what it means. English does this all the time. You know, we're one of the most prolific languages at borrowing other languages' words. That's why English is so hard in many ways. You know, barbecue is a transliteration from the French for burnt. You'll eat barbecue, but you wouldn't eat burnt, right? See the problem? Okay. So what does Christianos mean? It has 2 parts to it in Greek. The first one is Christ. You recognize that, of course. That word in Greek means anointed or oiled. And it is the translation of the Hebrew Misha, Messiah in the English pronunciation. Okay, it means anointed. In Greek culture, you anoint somebody after they take a bath or for an athletic contest. Okay? And this is a famous statue. You find these all over the Greek world. This one's from the Vatican Museum. They're called apaxiomenos statues, where he's scraping the oil off. See, he's got the scraper here, and he's scraping the oil off of him. You put the oil on before the contest, so you'll be slippery and move and all that kind of stuff. Okay? So to call someone Christos in Greek doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Are you taking a bath? See? Are you getting into a contest? In Hebrew culture, in Jewish culture, priests, kings, priests, and prophets are anointed. In Greek culture, they're crowned. See, by the way, we don't anoint. Well, actually, we step this one up. In the British tradition, the king or queen is anointed first because she's head of the church, and then gets the crown. So that's a combination of the two traditions. Most of the time, you just give them a crown. Okay? Sidebar. Christos, there's the Greek letters, you can faint. Christos becomes Christos in Latin, and then in English, Christ. It's not a translation. If you were going to translate the word Christos, you would say the anointed one or the Jewish Messiah. That would be probably the most accurate translation, because that's telling you what anointed is a metaphor for the Jewish Messiah. But it's a transliteration. Think about it. If Latin had not transliterated, but translated Jewish Messiah, would we have ever gotten to Christology? Just think about it. You would be constantly reminded that he was a political figure. See? But when you make it Christus in Latin, technically what you do from a linguistic point of view, you can really go to sleep now, is it vacates the signifier. That is, you have a sound that points to no meaning, so you can make it mean anything you want to, as in the example of barbecue. See? Okay. Now you have this second part, the I-A-N, which actually comes over into English. This is a Latin suffix. So this is a loan word in Greek. It comes from a Latin suffix. And Greek used this loan word. And it means belongs to the party of or the adherent of. When you put that on the end of a noun, it changes the meaning to say you belong to the party of or you an adherent of that person. So here's an example, the Herodians. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Herodians are those who belong to the party of Herod. Clearly indicates it's political. This context clearly shows you this ending indicates a political reality. Okay. Christianos, therefore, means those who belong to the party of the anointed, are those who belong to the party of the Jewish Messiah. That would be, if you were going to translate it instead of transliterating it, that's what you should say. Okay? So that's really its translation. Now think about this. This is Augustus. This is a famous statue called Prima Porta. Notice he's in the form of Zeus, that's indicating his divine character, and he's got his breastplate on, celebrating his military virtues. And at the bottom is the cherub. Augustus was all about family values. It was big, very big for Augustus. It really was. I'm not kidding here. It's the absolute truth. He had a fertility problem on upper-class Roman women. It was too dangerous to get pregnant. So that was, but at any rate, so you can see this is a powerful person. So if you're going to go around calling yourself Christianos, an adherent of the Jewish Messiah, I belong to the political party of the Jewish Messiah, you got a problem. Because you don't belong to his party. He's not too happy about that. Also remember that in 78 to 71, there was a major Jewish revolt and the destruction of the temple, which Titus built an arch to celebrate. That's right at the head of the Roman Forum on the Via Appia. You have to walk through the darn thing to get into the Forum. Right there in your face. And in 132, there was another major revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Okay? And for both of these, they issued coins called Judea Capta, Judea captured. This is Judea mourning, and there's the Roman victor, and there's the shields that they have conquered. Okay? This is Vespasian, who was the father of Titus and was in charge of the whole darn thing. He sent Titus there to do it. All the emperors after Vespasian made coins with this on it. This is a coin I own. My wife gave it to me for my birthday one year. It was a wonderful gift because I've worked in this area. So, you know, you've got this arch in Rome. You've got coins that are all celebrating. This is what we do to people who revolt, and you belong to the party of a Jewish Messiah? You got a propaganda problem. At least a public relations problem. So that you have to think about that when you just translate Christian, that all goes away. None of that's in your mind. See, that's why translations are critical. Problem number 3, dating. I told you there are problems and problems and problems. Next week's the good stuff. All right. The dating of the Acts of the Apostles is highly controversial, and it's gotten more so. The traditional date was, that Luke was a follower of Paul, and he wrote Acts before Paul died. Okay, and the proof of that, well, he doesn't describe Paul's death in the end of Acts. 20th century scholarship really walked away from that, and you can't even, it's hard to find even really conservative scholars who think Luke's the author. That just doesn't work for lots of reasons. For one thing, he doesn't seem to know much about Paul. His Paul is very different from the Paul of the letters. And so most 20th century scholars, that was the tradition I was raised in, we argued it was written in 85, 95, not because we knew, we just knew it wasn't early. But, 85, 95 was a comfortable place. You could just put it in there and forget it. More recently, beginning around the turn of the century, several people advanced the argument that it's after 125. Getting late. One of those people who made this argument, and they make the argument basically on several grounds. It's a very technical argument. One is that the author of Acts knows Josephus, and Josephus' History of the Jewish War. And that's not written until in the 90s, so 85 to 90 is not going to work. You've got to get it back a little bit further. And he also seems to know a collection of the Pauline letters. So that would put you well after 100. Dennis Smith, who was my colleague of many years at Phillips, unfortunately died. He was a strong proponent of this thesis that it's after 125. I was in the resistor camp because it causes me problems for the parables. If Acts is 125, so is Luke, the gospel. And that starts to create some issues for me. Some of you who know me know I can be kind of tenacious, right? Dennis is right. He convinced me that that was the case, and so I've had to move. So if Acts is after 125, that changes the whole situation, because that means the earliest reference to use this word Christianus is in fact not in Greek but in Latin, and it's a letter from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan. And remember I told you the IAN was a Latin loanword. Okay? This is the most secure date we have in this whole problem. We know when Pliny was governor of Bithynia, from 111 to 113, so the letter's got to be written in that time span. We don't have a secure date for anything else. Okay, that's not in this period, we don't. Here's parts of his letter. The whole letter is a little on the long side. I have never participated in trials of the adherents of Christus. Now remember, Latin is the one who makes the transliteration. So he doesn't know who this Christus is. To him, it would be like saying in English, well, they're the adherents of Goldstein. You know, it's Jewish. It's a Jewish sounding word. Okay, and that's what he thinks it is. It's some kind of Jewish group. Traditionally translated Christians. I, therefore, did not know what offenses it is practiced to punish. Meanwhile, in cases of those who were denounced to me as adherents of Christus, I interrogated those. Now, interrogation here means not that he talked to them, he tortured them. That's how you interrogate. This is called the Roman Empire. As to whether they were adherents of Christus. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time. He's consistent. Threatening them with punishment, that is death. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. You know, not a problem. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Those who denied that they were or had been adherents of Christus, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer and incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought in for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christus, of which those who are really the adherents of Christus, it is said, cannot be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christus. There's that phrase in 1 Corinthians 12, you cannot curse the Lord. That's what he's making a reference to in Paul. It's this kind of test. Okay. I judged it necessary to find out the truth about this group by torturing 2 female slaves who were leaders. Now, there's 2 very interesting things here. One, he really goes after them because they're slaves, and they're women, and they're leaders of the group. This is the first, earliest evidence we have by an outsider to the group of leadership within the group, and it's of 2 women slaves. 2 women slaves. That's a very interesting point, folks. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. Depraved, excessive superstition is a way an upper-class Roman refers to Judaism. That's a standard stereotype way in Latin of referring, but upper-class way, and Pliny's very upper-class, of referring to Judaism. So it's a political issue. He's not concerned about religion. He's concerned about politics, okay? And the adherents of the anointed are a Jewish group. That's who Pliny thinks they are. And they probably do themselves. Christianus, then, is a Roman bureaucratic term. The earliest secure usage is as a Roman bureaucratic term, and it's a nickname. And like almost all nicknames, they start out by the outside group being used negatively against the in-group. Okay, so now let's go back to Acts. When Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was for an entire year they met with the community and taught a great many people, and it was in Antioch that the students were first called those who belonged to the party of the anointed. Now, what I want you to notice here, this is not the traditional translation. This is a real translation. It's in the passive voice. So what he's saying is, it was in Antioch that these people were first tagged with the nickname. It's not saying we call ourselves that. We think that's who we are. That's who they think we are. That's the point of the passive voice. Okay? The other passage in Acts where it's used is a really interesting one. It's in the trial of Paul before King Agrippa. Agrippa is Jewish. Okay? He's a Hasmonean. So he's Jewish. And it's the first of these three trials that Paul has at the end of Acts. Paul said, King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe. So he's acknowledging that Agrippa is Jewish and believes in the prophets. And therefore, Paul thinks you should believe that Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies. Agrippa said to Paul, are you so quickly persuading me to become one who belongs to the party of the anointed? Now think this through. Paul replied, whether quickly or not, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today might become as I am, except for these chains. Now, why does he point to the chains? Because to become an adherent of the Jewish Messiah is to get yourself into political problems. See, it's a rhetorical move. Okay? Now, in the traditional transliteration, Agrippa asks, are you sorry, I haven't done this for a while. Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian? What that really means is, are you trying to persuade me to convert to Christianity? See, that's how we understand that. In this new translation, Agrippa questions, are you asking me, a client of the Roman Emperor Augustus, to join the party of the anointed king of Israel? See, it takes on a whole different meaning when you actually translate it. See, it really starts to shift how these things mean. Now, martyrs. Remember I said that late in the 2nd century, the word began to be used a whole lot more, way back when we started? Where it gets to be used a whole lot more are in the stories of martyrs. That's where it comes to the head. And the martyr, we have lots of martyrologies and these kind of sayings in which either at death or before the judge, the martys means witness, okay? They witness, I am a Christian. That's where the word martyr comes from. The martyr witnesses, I am a Christian, okay? Ego sum Christianus. Okay? Now, there is a famous Roman story. It's a mythical Roman story set in the 4th century BCE. That's way back there. Okay? Before Rome's actually established and the Etruscan kings are trying to destroy the new city of Rome. And this character, Gaius Mucius, attempts to assassinate the Etruscan king. But he misses and kills his secretary. And so he's tried before the Etruscan king. And he says, Ego sum Romanus. I am a Roman, a citizen. Men call me Gaius Mucius. Notice he puts his Romanness before his name. See? So what it means is, I am of the party of Rome. I die as resolutely as I could kill, both to do and to endure violently, valiantly, not violently, but actually for Romans it works violently, real Freudian slip, is the Roman way. And this story, which is from Livy, you find it on inscriptions, it's all over the frickin' place. It's kind of the I am story of Roman culture. It tells you who you are as a Roman. It's kill or be killed. Do it violently, okay? So when a Christian stands up and says, I am Christianos, I belong to the party of the anointed, I will die in the way of the anointed. So it fits in this kind of historical context. In the 3rd century, after 212, remember the number of the century follows the, because we're in the 21st century, but it's only 20. I always hated that. It's because you didn't have a zero. They got it backwards. After the martyrs, and the martyrs became, in the late 2nd century and the 3rd and 4th century, the dominant, ideology is not exactly the right term, but it's close to it, but certainly the dominant mythological notion of what a Christian was. It became the ideal Christian. The martyrs became the ideal Christians, and a huge debating point. After that, a bureaucratic nickname became a name of honor. And this often happens in the history of nicknames. Okay? That what is used as a slur becomes an honor of pride eventually. You absorb it. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this in the history of nicknames. And therefore, it becomes, in the 3rd and 4th century, one of the major identifying names of the group. Because at that point, Christianus tells them who they are. They belong to the group of the martyrs, beginning with the martyr Jesus. And it becomes a tradition of martyrdom. Now, you don't need to get saccharine here. They're very sophisticated about this. One of the interesting things about the martyr, this gets us way off the topic, is most of our stories are of female martyrs. The most famous of one is Perpetua Infelicita. It's by far the most famous one. It's one in the early 3rd century, martyrdom. But almost all of our stories of martyrs are those of females. Many are slaves. Very few male martyr stories. So you have a recasting of what virtus means, okay? Of what it means to be a man, means to be in the image of a woman who is killed. That becomes a very positive image. And if you look at images of Jesus in the 3rd and 4th century, we don't have any in the 2nd century. Our earliest image of Jesus is from a baptismal font in 265, I think it is. He's androgynous. He's both male and female, which is one of the ways Paul says the body of Christ is to be viewed. The body of Jesus is male and female. So they pictured it as androgynous. So that's it to the days. Okay? I'm done.
Oh, you're done. Anybody have a question? Thought?
Yeah, I'd like to say, when I went to Rome and went in the catechisms.
Catacombs.
Yeah, catacombs.
Catechism's a book.
Very, very powerful, and to see how early Christians had to worship. When did they form?
Well, the catacombs, this is one of those sex questions.
How much do you want to know?
Right. The martyrdom is a funny thing because it really does become, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, the identifying factor that Christians use to sort out their self-identity questions. And actually, most of the stories of martyrdoms come after Constantine, when there weren't any martyrs. A large majority of them, very few of them, come from the 1st and 2nd. We have fragments and stories, and we know what's going on and everything. But except for Perpetua Infelicita, most of the major ones are much later, and they're pretty fictional. Early Christianity is also a weasel word. What do you mean by early? For me, it's anything prior to the 2nd century. Okay? For some people, it's all the way up to the 8th or 9th century. I mean, what do you mean? Catacombs were used by followers of Jesus. They were also used by Jews. They were also used by Romans. And they're public. Everybody knows where they are. You're not going to hide in a catacomb because everybody knows where they are. That's one of these fictions that arises in the post-Constantinian period. Post-Constantine is 312 and after. Sorry, I slip into technical usage and I forget that not everybody owns the same boxes. You know. So the catacombs are really, really important as shrines of commemoration, and that's where this martyrdom tradition gets built, because they would eat sacred meals there. And the eating of the meals is really one of the, we'll talk about this next week, is one of the most formative characteristics of these groups, is eating together. It's one of the few things they really all have in common, is they eat together. One of the problems with the catacombs is it's very hard to tell a Jewish catacomb from a Roman, from a follower of Jesus catacomb. And about the only way you can be absolutely sure is if they have the praying woman. There's an image called the praying woman. We have about 185 of them. There's an argument that we might have 186. See, more than you want to know. But it's of a woman praying. This is the Roman way you pray. And early Jesus groups took over as their iconography, Jewish iconography. Why wouldn't you? You're using the same stories. So the only way you can tell you're actually in one that belongs to the Jesus group is the woman's there. And she is the universal sign for Christians in the earliest one we have, I think it's 230 something. She represents the believer. She is the believer. So you have there's a sarcophagus from Santa Croce that's about 314, something like that. It's the religious story of his life, and she is standing right in front of him when he's dead. And she represents him. And he's an upper-class Roman gentleman. He sits on a stool. He's got his toga on. He's got his scroll. It means he's upper class. That's up your nose to the rubber holes with the values. I mean, seriously, with the values of the Roman emperor. That's really, man, you're going after it. That's a whole different definition of what it means to be a male. See? And that's going on. You're getting, to use a kind of modern term, gender bending going on in these groups. Because you saw with Porta Prima, the Romans have a very particular view of what maleness looks like. And the Christians have a very different view of what maleness looks like. That's called gender bending. See? Or you can get really radical and say it's queering. And then technically that's what it's doing. So, I mean, I'm sorry. See, that was one of those questions, and it's just like, I find that catacombs are really interesting. When I was a visiting prof in Rome at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 1984, and Max Zerwick's Jesuit priest's office was right next to mine. We got to be really good friends. And Max was in charge of the Vatican Archaeology of all the catacombs. So I really got to see him. And there's really interesting stuff in there. And Max used to always say, if the lady's not there, it's not Christian.
Mike?
Yeah, Frank, a quick question. If Acts was written somewhere after 125, when was Luke written?
It has to be about the same time.
That's what I say, those were written at the same author, same time, right?
Yeah. There's a whole... And actually, I'm involved in this. It's part of a project I'm involved with right now with an international group. And I'm getting too old to be involved in these darn projects. But thank God for Zoom. We don't have to travel. There's a tendency now to, in fact, I just finished a paper in Zeitschrift und Neuen Testament Wissenschaft, arguing for the date of Acts in the 90s. That people have traditionally argued in the 20th century that it was a reaction to the destruction of the temple. So the temple was destroyed in 70 and Acts was written in 71. Nah, that's not going to work. I mean, we don't even have any good novels about 9/11 yet. It takes a while for this stuff to percolate in a culture. I think Mark is written in response to Vespasian, Titus, and who's the third one? At any rate, the Flavians double down on this no building of the Roman temple. They're not going to build the Jewish temple back. And everybody expected them to do it, and they didn't. And that became Roman policy. And so you get 4th Ezra and Mark both get written in the 90s when it becomes clear there's not going to be any new temple, and that creates a problem for both groups. And so they're responding to that. I think both Luke in the Gospel, although I think the Gospel of Luke has more than one edition, so that complicates, this problem gets really bad. And the Gospel of Matthew are written in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt, not the 70 revolt, but the 132 revolt. So they
takes the standard 70, 80, 90, and moves it out another 30 years.
yeah, it's becoming more second century.
Yeah.
And I think that matches the manuscript evidence. We don't start to get manuscript really solid fragments, and they're all fragments, papyri fragments, really until after 185. Then we start to get them. They start popping up. So, and that would look right. That's about right. So that's the trajectory that scholarship seems to be moving right now. Or at least I'm one of the group trying to move it that way.
What was the dangerous fertility problem you referred to?
Birth.
It's just physically dangerous. So they
Upper class Roman women would, and their fathers could afford to do it, would, lose your daughter. So you adopt. Romans adopt like mad. So, for example, only 2 Roman emperors were the child of their natural father. All of the others are adopted. Augustus adopts Tiberius. He's his adopted son. Okay? And Augustus is Julius Caesar's adopted son. Okay? And if you read the birth narrative, the genealogy in Matthew, Jesus is the adopted son of Joseph. Remember, it's the wrong genealogy? See, it's Matthew's genealogy. Well, he's the adopted son, just like the emperors. I mean, it's an imperial claim, the way the thing's laid out. So, yeah, it's very dangerous. The most common form of birth control in the ancient world is exposure. Abortion is relatively unknown. They know about it. It happens. Women take care of it, okay? But it's dangerous. And so it's actually it's less dangerous to go through with the birth, and then if it's a girl, expose it. And that's how Christianity fundamentally grew in the 2nd century. Christians, we shouldn't even call them Christians, and I don't when I write, but it's hard when you talk. Those habits are deep in there. The followers of Jesus collected these babies, almost all of whom were female, and they raised them. And that's why you have all these women martyrs. Okay? And almost all conversion stories from the late 2nd and 3rd and 4th century are pagan men who married a Christian woman. The Christians got all the women, the pagans got all the men. Guess what happens? Guess who rules? Also, pagan women could not inherit property. Christian women could inherit property. Because equality is not the right word. That's a different standard from a modern period. But cooperative and co-responsible is more the concept that's what's going on. Reciprocality. They're quite reciprocal in the relationships. And that is a fundamental difference that you see in the 2nd and 3rd century. That's what goes away with Constantine. It becomes very Roman male.
Was Luke and Acts written by the same person? Was that person Luke, and was that person who wrote it looking through the lens of Greek philosophy as he tried to figure out who this person Jesus was?
You got about 10 questions.
You got about 5 minutes.
Okay, first question. Nobody really thinks today that the character described in Paul's letters, Luke the physician, is the author of any of these things. There's lots of reasons for that. The primary one of which is his theology is just completely different from Paul's. And he has Paul say things that just don't fit. For example, he describes Paul's experience on the Damascus Road as a vision. And Paul's emphatic that it's not. If you read Galatians, Paul says it's not a vision. And he makes fun of visions in Corinthians 6 and 7. So, I mean, that's, okay. Most scholars, I think the general opinion is, yes, they were written by the same person. That is, the final edition was written by the same person. Acts seems to be a single composition. It has very few seams in it. It's very smooth, very straight. Its rhetoric is very clear. The gospel has a lot of seams in it. The birth narrative doesn't fit with anything else. It's completely wonko. I mean, by that I mean it's just off in its own kind of way. And looks later, frankly. The mid-gospel section looks an awful lot closer to Matthew and shares a lot with Matthew. The resurrection stories are clearly at least two different traditions. In one tradition, he talks about, I've got flesh and bones. And in the other, on the road to Emmaus, nobody knows who he is, which is clearly not flesh and bones. So that there are different levels of tradition here. It looks more amalgamated. So you might have one or two different traditions, and then whoever put Acts together consolidated it into one piece. That's the kind of working theory that most people are working with. Figuring the details out is not easy, but that's the kind of one. The author of Acts and the author of Hebrews write the best Greek in the New Testament, by far. And when you look at the introduction, both to Acts and to the gospel, there are formal, what are called preparatios. There are formal grammatical Greek. And I used to teach New Testament Greek, and my students could never read it. It was just too hard. It's called Atticizing. He's trying to imitate Attic Greek. So it's upper class. When he's sending the reader a message, this is who I am. Now I'm going to write on a lower level because that's the way we do things in this group. But this is who I am. I mean, that's the point of doing something like that. And other Greek writers do it too. So it's a known thing to do. There's two possibilities there. He's either upper class or he's a slave who's been trained as upper class. My money's on the slave. Because his view of poverty, of the poor, is among the strongest in the New Testament. He really just does not like rich people. I mean, I'm sorry, he does not. I mean, he's the one who adds the woes to the Beatitudes. That's him. That to me looks like a slave who's been educated. And we know that a lot of slaves were highly educated because writing was considered manual labor. There's a letter from Atticus to Cicero in which Atticus has just gotten one of Cicero's letters, and there's one of Cicero's books, and there's a mistake in it. He gets the quote to Homer wrong. He doesn't blame Cicero. He blames Tiro, Cicero's slave, because he should have checked it. And there's plenty of evidence to indicate that Cicero does not know how to write. He dictates everything. Writing is manual labor. He's an upper class. So he may not even know how to make letters. When Tiro his slave does all the actual writing. You have a similar kind of thing in Romans 16. At the very end of Romans 16, it says, Ego tertia. I tertia. I have these things in Greek, and sometimes I'm sorry, it's just the way I recall things. I, Tertius, egropsai, have written this letter. That is, he's the one who took the dictation. So he gropsied it. He wrote it, and Paul dictates it. At the end of Galatians, there's also a remark that says, see with what large letters I write. Paul doesn't know how to write, so he's like a little kid, when you imitate the letters. We find this in papyri all the time. It's a way of witnessing, this is really my letter, but a scribe wrote it. So, see, I'm sorry. I tried to answer.
Size, composition, and so forth, exchanging of notions among the earlier groups of followers. Were they primarily women, as you indicated they had great influence? Were they relatively small? Was there interchange between or groups of people from one area to another?
Yeah, one of my teachers was Samuel Sandmel. Taught me rabbinics. And Sammy used to make up laws. And one of Sammy's laws was minimal evidence leads to maximal theories. And you have to kind of remember, we have a lot of minimal evidence at times. What we know is the group spreads rather rapidly. And to be truthful, it gets out of Jerusalem and out of Galilee in a hurry. Probably because there are problems. Okay? And it gets into Syria. You've got Paul. By the time Paul gets to Rome, there's already followers of Jesus there. So he didn't get there first. So, it is a moving group. What we know about these groups is Paul, for example, when he writes a letter to Corinth, he tells them he wants to gather the entire group together to read this letter. That's his standard practice, apparently. We know the size of rooms in Corinth. It was a well-preserved city that's been extensively dug. There's no room in Corinth as big as this room. Most rooms are the size of 4 by 8. They're very small. So you could maybe get 15, 20 people. That might have been the total number of converts he had. Remember, if Acts is written in 125, you can imagine something like Pentecost and you can get big numbers. But that's not going to happen. You got big numbers at Pentecost, the Romans moving down you so quick, made you scream. Dom Crossan's a good friend of mine. Dom used to say if 12 men arrived at a village, the first thing they'd think of was bandits. And he's right. He's right. You kind of get these things into context. So the dominant form of practice for these Jesus groups in the first two, we'll talk about this next week, are communal meals. Well, that's going to be 6, 7 people. So it's small groups, very, very small groups. Connections are really hard to talk about, and they're probably regional. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, wait. Thank you.